Despite how few steps it usually takes for a vampire to transform himself into a bat, it actually took Robert Pattinson well over 20 movies. His career has certainly had some interesting bumps and obstacles along the way, but Robert Pattinson has managed to evolve from somewhat of a joke in a widely panned franchise known as Twilight to honestly one of the best working actors alive. And I'm well aware of how ridiculous that statement sounds to someone who hasn't followed his career all that closely, but if you're able to separate the face from the one shared by Edward Cullen, then that statement becomes a lot easier to get on board with. Because Robert Pattinson is one of the most interesting actors working today, and one of very few whose movies I watch regardless of any other aspects strictly because he is in them. But how did it all get started for him? When did he manage to break out of that Twilight shell? Is he really the hottest man alive according to cold hard science? Let's find out all that and more in the incredible evolution of Robert Pattinson by me, Corndog Talks, or just Corndog. Yeah, Corndog. Talks is my surname. Although featured in deleted scenes from a movie in 2004 called Vanity Fair, his first real role was that of Cedric Diggory in the Harry Potter franchise, a role he apparently got largely in part due to those deleted scenes. When he arrived at the screening of Vanity Fair, no one had told him his role was cut. The casting director felt so bad that she gave him the first crack at the Cedric Diggory audition, which he obviously got. Now, playing a pretty beloved character combined with a serviceable performance, I, like many, would have reckoned he'd have his fair share of role offers just off the Harry Potter notoriety alone. But curiously, that wasn't really the case. Not one drawn by the appeal of becoming a mainstream movie star, Pattinson booked a few small roles he found intriguing in television films The Haunted Airman and The Bad Mother's Handbook in the years following. He also pursued a bit of a musical career at this time, but he himself has happily admitted he never really had the talent for it and it was not a great choice for him career-wise. After being fired from a play shortly before opening night, Pattinson actually found himself sleeping on his agent's couch back in LA with frighteningly few prospects on the horizon. Until Twilight came calling, an opportunity I am sure he is loath to admit did propel his career from barely ever even started to a legitimate chance to having a successful career in film. Like many actors, Pattinson always hated auditioning, and even went so far as to call his agent the morning of the Twilight one begging her not to make him go. Despite being excited and confident leading up to it, when the time came he had a bit of a breakdown and at the behest of his agent ended up taking a Valium for the first time ever on the way to his audition. Because of, well, basically the resulting high, his audition had a level of detached aloofness that seemed to work for the casting directors, and he got the role. Nowadays, and even back then to some degree, a lot of people claim Pattinson was one of very few bright spots in these movies, but I'm not sure I entirely agree. While he may have been one of the best aspects of these movies, watching them after becoming enthralled in him as an actor and seeing some of his genuinely incredible performances he's turned in, I can't in good conscience say the signs were there or a superstar in the making or anything like that. I think he really didn't like being on set every day and it leached into his performance at times. But there are some genuinely great moments from him, and maybe it's more because of what I've seen he and his movies are capable of that I don't give him as much credit as maybe he deserves for this role. But what did make me believe there could be something great in him were some of the roles he took during his Twilight era from 2008 to 2012, namely Water for Elephants and Cosmopolis. In Water for Elephants, he gave a somewhat reserved rendition of a man with nothing who joined the circus as a vet and fell in love with both the elephant he was tasked to raise and take care of, as well as the circus ringmaster's wife. Oddly similar to his role as Edward, I think this was just a more mature Pattinson putting the effort into a role he actually cared about. His charm and charisma is indelible, he's handsome as Christ, which doesn't hurt, and he has a wonderful cast to bounce off of. As an actor who eventually steals every single scene he's in and captivates you with every line, his character is much more intent with letting life happen to him here, and seeing him methodically react and weep through it all is quite lovely. Not an amazing movie, but a very charming one that gave us his best performance to date by far. But I think the undeniably more interesting role is him as the bizarre millionaire Eric Packer in David Cronenberg's Cosmopolis, which is just one of the weirdest movies I've ever seen. Want to know a good way to shed a recognizable role as an actor and prove you can be more than simply the character you became famous for? Star in something as fucked up as this. Taking place mostly inside a limousine as he is driven across town for a haircut, Cosmopolis features characters who are not people, but rather symbols shown mostly through the words they speak, popping in and out of the limo as the story moves along. He drives a few blocks, someone enters, they both monologue at each other, then the person promptly exits the limo and is never seen or heard of again. He has emotionless sex with various people throughout the film as well, and that's the key word for his character here. Emotionless. Cold and pretentious would also suffice. Throughout the limo ride, we learn his business empire is crumbling dramatically and very recently due to his inability to predict the trajectory of a certain currency, and he treats this as more or less a cosmic joke. He finds it amusing more than anything, and not in a laugh out loud way, but in a Raymond Holt, that's humorous kind of way.
I lost everything.
We see very little in the way of genuine emotion out of him throughout this movie, where he riffs on social commentary about capitalism and modern society as if he had meticulously planned out each phraseology months in advance. And I don't say this to put down his performance as if his lines seem overly rehearsed. That's what the character calls for, and he nails it. A genius so ahead of those around him that every single sentence he utters is as profound as it is flawless as it is pretentious. This movie watches as if it were designed solely to showcase Pattinson's skills, and I think that's the only reason this movie is so watchable. He's able to express all of these complex oddities within a 90-minute film, trying its hardest to alienate the average viewer, and I dare say he manages to make a lot of scenes pretty darn captivating. He garnered almost universally positive reviews from this, even if the movie itself did not, but it wasn't the type of role to thrust him into superstardom, which, as I've said, he's never really seemed all that interested in. Throughout his time on the Twilight set, he became infamous for his constant mocking of the franchise and his disdain for everything from his role to the movies and to the writer of the books themselves. Though some found it arrogant and entitled, a lot of people just respected and appreciated the authenticity. And since only the most hardcore of fans could possibly posit the notion that Twilight wasn't to be mocked, many agreed with what he was saying and found it funny and endearing. We also got to see a lot of his anxiety and disinterest in a life in the limelight here as well. The only time he seemed comfortable during interviews was when he was shitting on his own movie. Other times he'd be quiet, reserved, shy, awkward, or just straight up lying. There's a pretty famous incident of his where he said in an interview that he watched a clown die in front of him at a circus, only to admit later he completely made the entire story up because he had no idea what to say in the interview. Had he said this in 1981, I think his career might have sputtered out a bit, but it being the early 2010s, where talking about things such as imposter syndrome and anxiety were starting to become a bit more mainstream, I think this only helped with audience connection. Like before, they appreciated the authenticity, maybe started shopping around the rest of his filmography, and came to find a genuinely good actor. After Twilight concluded, he took on a few roles that did decently, and then decided to try something pretty unique and cool. Rather than wait for offers that might be intriguing or challenging for him, he started obsessively watching the films of lesser-known filmmakers for some sort of connection or hidden talent to contact in an effort to work together, sometimes even going as far as to have them write a movie with a character specifically in mind for him. And thus, Robert Pattinson's first true masterpiece of a role came to exist: Good Time. A wonderful movie directed by the Safdie brothers, otherwise known for their immense success with Uncut Gems, this movie thrives off of its intense chaos and how every single aspect of this film is designed to induce anxiety. And at the forefront of it all is Robert Pattinson as not only our main character, but really the only character we actually get to spend any considerable amount of time or energy on. Pattinson mentioned speaking with the brothers in a hotel one day, saying, "Whatever you guys are doing next, I want to be a part of." Much to Pattinson's surprise, they leapt at the offer and wrote Good Time, sending him the script within 6 weeks. In it, Pattinson plays Connie, and the entire movie is about him trying to break his mentally disabled brother out of jail after the two of them rob a bank together. Throughout the film, Pattinson manipulates and fucks over basically everyone who comes across his path in an effort to save his brother. And many people find his character compelling because, yeah, he's a bad guy, but his motives are good. He wants to save his brother. But he's only in jail because he convinced him to rob a bank with him. He manipulated him, like he does to countless others throughout this film. And it could be argued that he only wants to break his brother out to save his own ass, so this is very much a shady, scummy character, and Pattinson plays it perfectly. Beyond perfectly. His actions aside, his facial expressions and mannerisms exude such a lack of trustworthiness that I can't fathom why anyone would ever want to associate with him, let alone help him. Except for that he can be pretty charming when he wants to be, he's super pushy, and as I've said, just a grade A manipulator. If someone offers to let him borrow their phone for a quick call, he'll just take it for the next few hours and probably run up long distance charges. Someone lets him use their bathroom to go pee, he steals all of their drugs, hair dye, and then makes out with her 16-year-old granddaughter so she doesn't see the news talking about him being a wanted man. The first part was a hypothetical example, the second one actually happened here. I really can't imagine anyone else in this role, and I think this is a very harmonious blend between an excellent script, excellent direction, and an excellent lead performance. I think a successful movie and a successful performance is one that elicits emotion, and this one elicits far stronger emotions than most movies could ever dream of. It has one of my favorite lines ever.
Don't be confused. It's just gonna make it worse for me.
And that just sums up this performance perfectly. A person who doesn't even consider others' well-being unless it directly affects him, and Pattinson manages to portray all of that so well here. He even manages to manipulate a lot of the audience into thinking he's a guy worth cheering for, which I personally do not think he is. He exists in a bit of a middle ground between decent guy and a total scumbag, but I think we only get the very briefest glimpses of decent stuff amidst an absolute onslaught of the scummiest shit you've ever seen. Good Time? More like disgustingly anxious time. What a flick. What's next? 2019 saw Pattinson take on Robert Eggers' psychological horror The Lighthouse, another incredibly bizarre film by a fascinating director, and although I don't think it's quite as untraditional as Cosmopolis, for 99% of the population this would be the weirdest film they've ever seen. It's gorgeously strange. Where Cosmopolis failed at times in making us actually care about the weird shit happening, The Lighthouse kind of excels in that regard. It's shot in pretty much just one location the entire time, and it only ever features two characters, starring Willem Dafoe and Robert Pattinson, who both give legit top-tier performances. The fact that Oscars snubbed everything about this movie just goes to show they have next to no credibility when it comes to films that don't fit their hyper-specific criteria. Willem Dafoe plays a louder, grandiose, monologue-heavy, eye-catching role here, but it's Pattinson whose character gets to grow and explore different levels of emotion here as the layers of his character are slowly revealed throughout. He really holds the framework of this movie together. Sometimes he's calm and subdued, sometimes he's angry, scared, depressed, sometimes he's having potentially imaginary sex with a mermaid, and at one point he definitely catches a fucking seagull and beats it to death against a rock. He gets to go manic and crazy at the end, and honestly, if you've seen a few of his movies, including this one, and you still think he's just the Twilight guy, or at the very least you don't think he's an incredibly versatile actor, probably give your head a shake. This is an amazing film and another amazing performance, and the world at large was very much starting to take notice of the sparkly vampire. And his next wave of films, in my opinion, are even more impressive. In the same year as The Lighthouse, we've got The King, then in 2020 we've got Tenet and Devil All the Time. But we're going to ignore Tenet for a moment here and focus on those other two because there's another facet to Pattinson's acting that has come under fire at times, and yet I think it's one of his most fascinating elements. His accents. Pattinson embodies an interesting archetype here as he simultaneously doesn't take himself or any of his movies too seriously, and yet still manages to throw himself into his roles to wonderful effect nonetheless. This allows him to play his characters with a level of looseness that allows him to really sink into them, and nowhere is that better exemplified than in his many expressive accents. Sometimes they're not even necessarily super accurate, but they're a perfect fit for him and the character. And a great example of that is him as the Dauphin of France in Netflix's period piece The King. Historically precise? Perhaps no. Scene stealing, fun as hell, super captivating? Without a doubt. He has stated that his accent for Good Time was more symbolic in his mind with a particular character he was playing rather than an attempt to actually imitate a queen's accent, but his one in The Lighthouse was based on a very specific small region in Maine where the accent has remained unchanged for hundreds of years despite sounding nothing like the traditional American. So he's batting both ways. It just depends on what would work best for the particular film.
I enjoy to speak English. It is simple and ugly.
In The Lost City of Z, while I can't speak too much on its historical accuracy, it fits the movie perfectly being calm and reserved. He's not the main focus of any scenes, and his accent mirrors that. His voice too. He whispers loudly more than truly speaking. He fades into this role perhaps more than any other. In Cosmopolis, on the other hand, it's more of a manifestation of how a person with that mindset might generate words and sentences. It's cold and calculated, almost devoid of intonations. He even auditions in a different voice than his British one, and he's never used his normal voice for any of his films since he's always tweaking and altering his speech patterns and mannerisms to better reflect the character. Like with Christian Bale, I think it's a huge compliment when you can hear a famous actor give an interview and for the very first time realize what their voice actually sounds like. The Devil All the Time, playing a supporting role to Tom Holland in easily his best non-Spider-Man role, is a super fucking fun performance in an underrated movie, and just listen to this shit.
Delusions! Blaspheming the Lord in your mind and in your heart for some wrong done to you by another person.
Apparently he hid this accent from everyone involved until the day of shooting, and it just blew people away. I'm pretty sure no one in history has ever actually spoken like this, but it manages to get across such specific emotions somehow. This is a guy pretending to be holier than thou, and he's doing a really good job of convincing most people, but not everyone, not our main character, and by extension, not us, and it makes his eventual comeuppance glorious to behold. If you've been paying attention thus far, despite his immense versatility, there is always an undercurrent of shadiness to be found. He hides it with varying success in his roles, by design, but the lack of trust and the uncertainty you always feel for his characters always keeps you on your toes and guessing. He never lets you know too much, and he never lets you have a good grasp of where he might be going next. Usually a lot of his duplicity revolves around not trusting him because he's hiding something dangerous or criminal, but Tenet offers us an extremely large subversion of his usual deceitfulness in ways that I could only properly break down in a video all on its own. A video that I, quite frankly, am dying to make. Tenet is one of my favorite movies of all time, and a severely misunderstood one for many reasons. Starring in a Christopher Nolan movie in a major role was Pattinson's largest achievement yet. One of the greatest directors alive working at peak capacity in a tumultuous time when the very foundation of theaters was on the brink of collapsing, or at the very least radically changing due to the COVID-19 climate, with a staggering budget of $200 million meant this movie was an absolute behemoth with a lot on the line. The critical reception is as mixed as any movie you'll ever see because this is an untraditional movie pushing the boundaries of storytelling and characters in a very massive way. Without diving in too deeply, Pattinson plays a high-level operative named Neil who works within the Tenet organization of the CIA. He is the protagonist's handler and they work together throughout the film. The main aspect of this movie is time inversion, the ability to essentially operate through the flow of time in reverse, rewriting the laws of entropy. Although he doesn't directly recruit him, Neil is the first person the protagonist works with, and Neil explains to him everything about Tenet and their mission, which is to prevent a disaster that occurs in the future. The twist at the very end, if you want to call it that, since the entire movie is one big twisty mindfuck, is that the protagonist actually recruited Neil in the future. He founded Tenet and created the organization he himself just got recruited into. Now, the insanity of that aside, that means the shady untrustworthiness of Pattinson in this movie is just that he can't really reveal exactly who he is or what his relationship with the protagonist is because it might melt his brain and jeopardize their mission. He's kind of being the opposite of shady, essentially. This movie thrives off of never letting the audience understand the full picture. Once they figured out X, we've moved on to Y. You're always a scene behind in terms of information, and Neil always seems like the opposite, something he's called out for at times by the protagonist. He always knows more than he should, and being able to portray that largely through subtle physical acting and mannerisms is an astounding accomplishment. This comes through even better on repeat watches, something I dare say this movie outright demands. While filming Tenet, not only did Pattinson often have no clue what was truly going on scene to scene, but he would frequently sneak away from set to secretly audition for a role very close to Nolan himself, Matt Reeves' The Batman. Once Nolan found out about this, well, he was all for Pattinson becoming the next Dark Knight, a role that was written by Reeves specifically with Pattinson in mind. Christian Bale, Nolan's old Batman, had something similar to say, calling Pattinson a fascinating actor and a great choice. Despite all of this, fan reception to the casting was a bit more negative. Starring in a Christopher Nolan blockbuster was one thing, but portraying one of the most iconic and beloved characters in history was something else entirely, and the legion of both casual and passionate fans of the Caped Crusader took to the internet in droves to heavily criticize the choice. For most, they simply thought Pattinson, Twilight, whiny little baby, not rugged. No, not gonna happen. Not on my watch. The enthusiasm towards his casting only heated up as the movie neared its release date, but eventually people on the other side of the spectrum started chiming in as well. They were probably alive and well the entire time, but nothing travels across the internet faster than some good old-fashioned outrage, so it's hard to recall a time when there was good, genuine discord about both sides for that first little bit. Then the first trailer dropped, and aside from the people just shouting incoherent nonsense proclaiming Pattinson the worst actor in the world and deciding the movie was already the worst superhero movie ever made after a 2-minute trailer, from my vantage point, consensus seemed to change a bit. As more trailers and teasers and interviews continued to drop, it looked more and more like this movie and this performance might actually be something really special. And to me, it certainly was. My first YouTube video ever was actually earlier this year on the Batman, and surprisingly I still really like how it turned out, despite a healthy chunk of rookie mistakes here and there. So feel free to give it a click and get a better idea of my thoughts on the entire film. But to summarize, it's really good. Really, really good. And it's largely a character study on a fresh-faced Batman, meaning the reason it's so good is mostly because of Pattinson's performance. Immaculate doesn't even really do it justice. The movie itself is excellent, though I do have at least a few more problems with it than with Pattinson's performance, but still excellent nonetheless. Critical reception seems quite good, and the box office scores speak for themselves. And that's all despite Pattinson announcing he would switch careers to porn if the movie flopped, no doubt prompting at least some people to forego the movie in favor of seeing him exchange the batsuit for one made of leather. In my own experience, it seems like the majority of the people who are still against this movie and the casting are the louder ones who are a little more set in their ways, often simply referring to him as the Twilight Guy, saying he's a terrible actor, and saying this is a horrible and unfaithful version of Batman. And only one of those three things is objectively true, because I do truly believe you just can't say he's a bad actor anymore. You can't even really say he isn't a good one. You can say he isn't your thing, not your cup of tea, sure. There are plenty of actors I easily and handily recognize the talent and quality of, yet do not personally find them as interesting or enjoyable as others, but that by no means should suggest I think they're poor actors. And in terms of this movie being unfaithful, I don't think many true Batman fans can say that with a straight face. This is a gorgeous rendition of a young Batman in the infancy stages of his vigilantism, and his psyche is explored beautifully here. You may not like certain directions they took, and you might even hate the origins of this young Batman in general. That's perfectly fine too. Just because a comic, even a popular or mainstream one, did it doesn't mean it's automatically good and sacred, but to call it unfaithful is to be incorrect as far as I'm concerned. If you probe the sections of the internet where people take long and critical looks at this film, the majority of it seems to be composed of positive and content fans more than pleased with what they've received. There are problems, yes, but the people who want to call it horrible and boring are usually the same ones not willing to look at it objectively and really come to grips with why they feel the way they do about certain elements. A similar thing often happens in the other direction with incredibly popular things. I can think of several examples in recent memory alone. But regardless, directly up next for Pattinson is his starring role in Mickey 7, directed by Oscar darling Bong Joon-ho, a sci-fi featuring another underrated versatile gem in Toni Collette. I can't wait for this one, and I can't wait to see the rest of Pattinson's career unfold as well. I have no doubt he'll continue to turn people on to his uniquely authentic, anxious, wonderful mind with every new release, and I am so glad things like The Batman and The Lighthouse have managed to showcase his talents to more and more people. My top 5 favorite actors list is a sacred one, and he has his spot comfortably fixed within it, etched in stone. I hope you guys enjoyed hearing about Robert Pattinson's wonderful transformation from brooding vegan vampire to emotionally scented crime fighter, and I can't wait to take a look at another career in a similar fashion sometime soon. There will be plenty of other videos until then, so remember to like and subscribe for more in the future, and I'll see you then. Thanks for watching.